On this episode of China Uncensored, what's 5 times the price of a cargo ship and not quite as good? Why, it's China's freight train to Europe. All aboard for OBOR! Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm your host, Chris Chappell. Well, chalk another one up for China's central planning masterminds. They've built a network of railways to connect exporters in China with markets in Europe, and vice versa. Sort of. It's called the New Eurasian Land Bridge, or NELB for short. It's a terrible acronym for an impressive-looking set of rail lines. They run some 7,500 miles across Eurasia, stretching from eastern China to western Europe. How does it work, you ask? Let's take a look at this helpful cartoon from state-run China Daily.
I'm a bottle of British whiskey, heading to China by China Railway Express. See you on board. What a journey to China's Yiwu. 18 days and 7,500 miles.
But for this British whiskey bottle, it's also a journey of the heart. But how does Miss Vitamin feel about Mr. Whiskey?
And of course, now we've run into each other.
I'm just glad we're making a contribution to the country's economic growth.
How patriotic. But what is that economic contribution exactly? Well, the New Eurasian Land Bridge should have been called the Freight Line Overland Path instead, because from an economic standpoint, it's a flop. Sorry, Miss Vitamin. One big reason is small capacity. A freight train can only carry a fraction of the cargo of a container ship. According to Forbes, the total capacity of the NELB over an entire year represents, at best, just 4 days of business for the port of Shanghai. So if you plan to transport large amounts of stuff, boats can't be beat. Shipping is also cheaper. Much cheaper. Rail freight on the NELB costs up to 5 times as much as sea transportation. Plus, rail's got another snag. The freight cars have no heating or air conditioning. Some of the train lines cut across parts of Russia. So, for example, Spanish olive oil producers selling to China need to wrap the bottles in blankets to keep them from freezing and exploding. Local wildlife would be devastated if there was an olive oil spill. Of course, for the locals, it means pre-marinated chicken. So if the cartoon we watched earlier was accurate, Mr. Whiskey would be looking on in horror as all of his friends froze to death. But even when temperature-sensitive goods are bundled in blankets, for some products, rail is still only an option in spring and fall when the weather's mild. That's why Spanish food and beverage producers are saying thanks but no thanks to the NELB. Chinese oil importers could always try local sources.
Cooking oil in China is recycled from the gutters.
On second thought, they should just bring in the olive oil on ships. Fans of the Eurasian Rail Link point out that rail is twice as fast as sea and half the price of air. Well, it is definitely faster than a cargo ship. But as far as being cheaper than flying, the wildly exaggerated claim made by my favorite Chinese state-run media, the Global Times, says freight train cargo costs 1/5 the price of sending goods by air. But the Global Times also says China is a champion of human rights, so let's just take that with a cargo container of salt. According to a professor at the University of Sydney, it could end up costing just as much to send your cargo container on an 18-day trek on the FLOP train as it would on a 1-day jaunt in a climate-controlled airplane. And that's because Chinese subsidies for the NELB are rumored to be as high as 50%. That means the price being charged right now doesn't reflect the real economic cost. And while Mr. Whiskey's journey makes it seem like most of the goods on the railway are being transported from Europe to Chinese markets, that's not really what's happening. A little over a year after the Madrid Yiwu Express started running, 39 trains had gone from China to Spain, but only 8 trains returned to China with Spanish exports. And so it's not surprising that Tom Holland from the South China Morning Post says that compared to sea or air, the Europe-China freight service just makes no economic or environmental sense either coming or going. But if the numbers don't add up, then why do it? The new Eurasian Land Bridge is a core part of Xi Jinping's One Belt, One Road initiative. He plugged it hard in front of 29 heads of state in Beijing during last year's Belt and Road Forum, or BARF. One Belt, One Road, or OBOR, is about building huge infrastructure projects around the world, like seaports, bridges, tunnels, and train lines. It's supposed to make China look like a benevolent and cooperative rising power that uses its own cash to create jobs and increase trade in other countries. But it's also about projecting soft power and giving China more leverage in future negotiations, as well as finding more markets for Chinese exports. And like I said last week in our episode about the 16+1 countries, China's got a growing interest in Europe, which means projects that make no economic sense turn out to be an investment worth making. Oh, and what happened to Mr. Whiskey and Miss Vitamin? They lived happily ever after, in the kind of store that stocks their alcohol right next to their medications. So what do you think about the new Eurasian Land Bridge? Leave your comments below. Thanks for watching this episode of China Uncensored. Once again, I'm your host, Chris Chappell. See you next time. Keep tabs on how China is projecting soft power in your neighborhood. Visit ChinaUncensored.tv. We upload full half-hour episodes you won't see on YouTube. Learn about harebrained projects the Chinese regime is planning in your region, even before world leaders do. ChinaUncensored.tv.